So hello again, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eli Boyne, and I'm a preservation specialist here at NEDCC. And so I'd like you to welcome you today to today's session, which is how to host a community scanning day. Let's go ahead and get started by looking at today's agenda. And so I want to get everyone thinking about the elements of creating a community scanning day and making and presenting collections with your community. So to do that, we're going to go over some of the bullet points we see here on this slide. And so first, how do we build community for our event? What are some things that need to be done well in advance to ensure we're reaching out to our community and we have a successful turnout? Then, what are your goals? So what might the goals of your participants be? And then what are your goals as a host? Next, how are you going to meet those goals? So there's some useful forms that you can consider, as well as enlisting volunteers and colleagues, and then coming up with an order of operations and deciding what the deliverables of your scanning day is going to be. Let me see here, let's go ahead. Next, you want to say how you might have already decided on how you're going to complete your actual digitization for your scanning day. But we're briefly going to run through some ideas for setting up and selecting the tools that are going to work best in your situation. We'll also talk about access and delivery systems, or rather, what's going to happen with your scan material after your event. Where will it live and how will it be used? And then last, we'll touch on rights and privacy concerns. And so giving those a little thought ahead of time is really going to help avoid any issues about privacy and the like right from the very beginning. And then finally, when we wrap up, we'll have some resources available to help you plan and scale a community scanning day to suit your needs. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video here so we can all focus on our slides. Okay. So before we dive into some of the nuts and bolts of your event, let's speak first a little bit about community building. We know that our community members are really what make this event. And so we want to talk about some tools that can be helpful to help build effective connections. As we think about our community, one of the best places to start, and something that you're very likely already doing at your institution, is focusing on building community connections. For your community scanning event, you might be eager to connect broadly with your community, or there might be a particular group you're hoping to attract to highlight a specific aspect of your area's history. It's important to acknowledge that building community relationships takes time and effort, and there may need to be outreach and training completed by your team to form such partnerships. So UMass Boston has created the great website ROPA, which we see here on the screen, or the Roadmap for Participatory Archiving, to show how to build an inclusive event that can help bring in a large and representative turnout. And so I've posted a link to their website here, and this can be a really great place to start your project. Here you're going to see information on how to ensure inclusiveness, how to define the stories you're collecting, and how to engage participants in your event. This website that we see here, it's a continuation of the Mass Memories Roadshow. Some of you may be familiar with that activity. And we're going to be referencing a lot of resources today from their handbook. So I encourage you to check it out. As we prepare for our event, there's two things I want to emphasize that we can do well in advance to make sure it's a success. Overall, we want to ensure inclusiveness by preparing for the event both internally with our team and then externally with the community. Bringing treasured materials to be shared with the repository can involve some vulnerability and risk. And so to make sure that our community members feel comfortable sharing their stories, it's good to invest time and effort into building open relationships, both with your team members and with the community. For your event, you'll likely be assembling volunteers and staff to help with the logistics of scanning and documenting your materials. We know that each of us comes from a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences, and it can be helpful to examine and acknowledge these experiences and learn how we each approach any implicit biases that we may hold. And so ROPA, which we see an image of again here on the screen, they offer some great tools and strategies for building cultural competence that can make sure that our visitors participating in the event are valued and respected. Outside of our institutions, we want to make sure that we reach our community members to let them know about the event. And so marketing is a key strategy for this, and we're going to get into some exact steps that can be taken later in the webinar. But to make sure our message is heard, we need to do some groundwork to build a relationship with the community. This can involve meeting people where they are, working with community groups, and acknowledging that the event that you're hosting is a collaborative partnership. And so, as ROPA states in its definition of participatory archiving, a community scanning event is a time when archivists, historians, and community members work together to document local and community history. Building these partnerships takes transparency and trust, and ROPA has some excellent tools on their website that you can use to start building those relationships. In the end, we know that we want to help build a more inclusive archival record, and this is a time when community members can really shine and share their stories and perspectives. And so with some of the preliminary groundwork laid for your event, let's get more specifically into our goals. We can speak about the goals that we have as an institution and the goals that your community members have as contributors to the event. As we start to build relationships with the community, we can start to think more concretely about our participants or our contributors really, what their needs are and what their expectations are for the day. So for example, in addition to having their materials digitized, people who are coming to your event might want to have images of their personal items included in your collections and to be represented as part of the community. As we've noted, a community scanning event can really be a great place for people to tell their stories and share their legacy in their own words. So as you begin to plan, be clear about what's happening with the digital copies of their things. So will they be fully accessible online? Will there be an online exhibit? Or perhaps the event will be self-contained and end up being an online catalog of what was brought to the scanning day itself. Maybe they can have their digital file emailed to them or take a copy home on a thumb drive. You know, there's a variety of ways to add value to the participants' experience while they're at your event. And so that's something you can think about building too. So perhaps there can be a storytelling station where a participant can talk about the item that they brought, or maybe about the experience that they're having at scanning day. Or they can have their picture taken with their items to show their connection to their story. Your event might, your participants and your contributors, they might also be wanting the opportunity to talk to other members of the local cultural heritage community, whether that be like-minded individuals or representative of organizations like libraries and historical societies to get advice on care collections at home or learning more about your organization. When we get into our day of event planning, we also need to consider our own goals as host of a community scanning day. So a good question to ask is, how does the community content fit within the scope of your own collections? And how will you organize and store the new digital content that you're making? You might be thinking of the new content as part of your overall digital collections, or maybe as we mentioned, as an event that's going to be displayed separately. You'll at least want to know how to organize and name your newly created files, and then have a place to store them. It's quite possible that your ultimate goal is to be involved in the community and then capture a moment in time when everyone's sharing their story and thinking about preserving their personal and collective histories. By hosting the event, you're communicating that you're invested in being stewards of your community's cultural heritage. As such, it's a great opportunity to connect with your community and offer resources to them for caring for their collections in an interactive and a participatory environment. But One good question to ask is, why are we digitizing content at all? And what might we say in our program outreach to encourage people to come to our event? Well, we as practitioners know that we're digitizing to save materials that are disappearing, and we know that the survival of many types of content depend on digitization. So whether because it's a glass negative and it's difficult to view, like the image we see here in this picture on the screen, or because it's a really degraded photograph, we know that we're digitizing to save it. During an event like this, we're also using digitization to bring our community together and to learn from one another. So instead of focusing on what might be the usual suspects in our collections, which could be people like politicians or institutions, or maybe just influencers in general, we're gathering the stories of regular people. Perhaps we're even creating a collection that captures the essence of what our lives are like today for the benefit of future generations. We know that improving access is probably familiar to any one of you who does reference work. We know that these days, everyone expects to be able to quickly access things digitally now. Um, some potential users of our collections, they don't want or they can't travel to our institutions to see materials. And so they want us to just email them a picture or just to have our content available online. And we, as advocates for cultural heritage materials, we want to provide as much access as possible. This provision of accessibility to personal collections might be attractive to the participants of the scanning day too. And so not only can contributors access their own digital materials online, and then also in that way cut back on excessive handling of family heirlooms, they can also easily share these materials with others and have a presence in our collective history. Okay, so we know why we want to digitize our collections, but we also need to select and prioritize which items to scan. And so it might seem obvious to those of us who are used to working with collections, but you really want your participants to think critically about what materials to bring and what would benefit most from digital access. And so if multiple people have copies of something like a group photo for a social club, like you see here on the screen, you want to digitize what would be quote unquote the best one. And so that means the most original one that's in the best condition. You also want to be clear about what you have the capacity to handle and are actually allowed to digitize at your event. And so this is another thing that it might seem fairly straightforward at first glance, but it doesn't hurt to be explicit about your limitations, especially when you're speaking with your community and planning the event. And so maybe you want to limit formats in order to exclude large scrapbooks or three-dimensional items like clothing or textiles. And also think about whether you feel comfortable helping people with fragile items or if they should not risk transporting such fragile items to the event in the first place. You'll also do well to limit the total number of items each person can bring, making sure that you have enough time to work with each participant. And so Mass Memories Roadshow, which we referenced in the beginning, they have a 3-item limit, for example, for their events. And speaking of Mass Memories Roadshow, they've developed some clever workarounds to handle any exceptions to your rule. And so, for instance, at one of their events, a commuter showed up with the first fire truck to town, an actual vehicle that was mounted on the back of a tow truck. And this was the item that he wished to be digitized. So obviously, that's not something that you can just pop onto a scanner. So they were able to document the fire truck by photographing it at the event, and then they used that photo as its digitization. All the associated information was captured, and the photos were included in the online display that was created for their community scanning day. Now, we know that fire truck quite literally is a pretty large exception, but to make things more straightforward, you might choose to narrow down the selection to perhaps a single format. And so depending on what you imagine for the day, and what your own limitations are in terms of equipment, you can really narrow that down. And just in case, if you want some guidance here, it can be best to avoid any very deteriorated or fragile works, any light sensitive media like negatives, or any media that might require highly specialized equipment. And of course, you want to avoid any moldy or pest infested works. Okay, so we're cruising right along here. So we've considered what we want out of a community scanning day and what our community wants from it as well. And so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details and start putting the event together. And so here we're going to go over some steps here that we see on the right, especially our order of operations. So hopefully that can help you figure out exactly the things to do with your logistics to put together a successful community scanning day. So like any program, you're going to need to schedule it out and determine an appropriate location to hold the event. The planning and scheduling phase involves several people and can take quite a while, so try to give yourselves plenty of time for planning. You want to put together an agenda for the event that includes the goals that we just discussed, and then make a schedule that you will refine over time. It's also going to be helpful to set some deadlines for major planning. So that can be things like reserving the location that you'll be using, contacting and building relationships with your potential partners, getting outreach materials ready, recruiting volunteers to help with the event, and then training those volunteers alongside any staff who are also going to be helping on the day of. You'll also need to be thinking about the more practical aspects of the event. And so whether you're going off-site and into a specific community, or whether you're hosting it at your own institution, be sure that you have access to sturdy tables, convenient electrical outlets, and enough space for people to circulate and carry their items, as well as chairs for staff and participants alike. And so if you think of anything that beyond what's listed here on our slide, you can always write it down. And so we know sometimes the most obvious things are the easiest to overlook, simply because you think there's no way that anyone could ever possibly forget them. It can be seen as like the classic grocery list problem. So if it's not something on the list, it's highly unlikely that it's going to make its way into the basket. Also remember that there's always going to be the inevitable hitch in setting up your equipment. We know it's worth it to set up early and check to make sure that everything's working as expected. You might even do a run through with staff and volunteers before the event officially begins. So this can be a really great way to figure out the flow, make sure that everything is kind of running as it should. And it's a way to make sure that everyone is working on the same page as far as the order of operations go. And we'll discuss that order of operations in just a moment. Also want to make note too that the things that we see on the slides here, yes, thank you. I was just going to mention that. This presentation will be available to check out later. I know we're trying to get everything in 1 hour, so we're going through material pretty quickly. These slides will be available to you. Kim is going to send you an email that has our slide deck and also a page full of resources that has lots of helpful links. So you'll be able to watch this again, see the slides, and have some resources to check out after this is done today. Okay. So going back to our logistics here, I want to stress the importance of capturing information about your contributors and the things that they've brought with them on a standardized form. And so the form, which you can see here, this is a sample from the Mass Memories Roadshow. This is going to really help you with managing intellectual control of each scanned item that you have, and then connecting that to the person who brought it. And so it should capture the form that you use. It should capture information like the creator of the item, the content that it is, the type of material that it's on, and the dates that it was either created or the date that you captured it, which will keep the digitized content properly attributed and then help with your file organization and your metadata. You'll also want to provide some internal tracking information to keep everything organized behind the scenes after the event. As you can see, Mass and Arrays Roadshow, they developed the form that we see here on the screen, and they have a lot of experience to inform what's on it. This is a Mass and Arrays Roadshow for those of you who aren't familiar. It's an event that's taken place in Massachusetts. I believe it was started maybe even 10 years ago. And so they've hosted these community scanning days quite a lot. So through their trial and error and experience, they've been able to put together some resources that are really useful. And a handout to their guide, they have a handbook, and so that's included in your handout for today's. Almost 20 years ago, thank you, Heather. And so yes, so they have a lot of experience, and we have a link to their handbook in our resource packet today. So to get back here, not only does a form, this tool, a form like this help us establish intellectual control, but importantly, it's also going to capture the story of each item directly from the person who brought it. And yes, Christina, there will be a link to the packet. It'll be emailed to you after our webinar today. And so again, we really want to capture the story of each item directly from the person who brought it. That's something that makes the community scanning day really special. The storytelling piece of scanning day, it's really key to the community building and fostering a participatory history. And so again, think about the man with the fire truck. The digitization of his item really came together in the documentation of his story and the historical importance that the truck had to the community. I know with his fire truck, he was able to put out a call. He was hoping to get some information out that they wanted to restore the truck. And so that's another way that his story was able to get out, and he was able to speak to the larger community member about this item and his hopes for it. So the form that we saw on the last slide, it's going to become part of the order of operations during the event. And so it's really helpful for you and the participants to have some guidance through the event. This is going to help with your pacing, and it's going to allow to keep things organized throughout your community scanning day. So to set up an order of operations, you might want to have the participants start at a welcome and interview station, where they're asked about themselves and what they brought, essentially filling out the form that we just discussed. This station welcomes them into the space and makes sure that you're able to record the information that you need for the event to be successful. It also establishes the basis for the intellectual control that you're going to need to maintain for the items that they're having scanned. From that initial introductory space, the participant can then take their items in the form that they filled out to the scanning station and get their materials digitized. The scanning station can have a person doing the scanning and then another person naming, uploading, and organizing the resulting files according to the information that's been gathered in the form. If you're using a paper form, which might be the easiest to track through introductions and the interview phases, you can scan it alongside the associated items and make a digital file folder for each contributor. A good tip is to make an inventory of needed supplies for each station and some instructions for those who are staffing the stations, and then perhaps designating a coordinator to make sure that everything is in place. Beyond having those two stations, feel free to get creative with other activities. And so one thing I've heard about happening is including a photo booth like on Antiques Roadshow, where participants talk to the cameraman about their experience and about what they brought. Or maybe some experts can be available to discuss collections or preservation or research. Representatives of other organizations, they might be on hand to help out and engage with the community. And so that brings me to our next slide here. So a community scanning day is a great opportunity to collaborate with like-minded organizations. And so a historical society could have their own table to meet the community and talk to potential new members. My colleague here at NEDCC, he mentioned that he's assisted with community scanning days before and was available to answer questions about collection care during the event. If you're the organization that's hosting the event, this could be a separate table to show the community what other types of services and programs that you provide. It could also be an opportunity to do outreach for other programs that you think the participants of the community scanning day would also enjoy. And so then speaking about outreach, as we mentioned in the beginning, it's the other component of logistics of putting together a community scanning day. And so here we see outreach. And so outreach is an important component to any program and something that's really essential for a community scanning day. So we've heard that word of mouth is often what drives participation in a community scanning day. And that kind of outreach can't exist without community partnerships. And so again, think of creative and transparent and collaborative ways that you can work with your community well in advance of the event. Once you've determined any partnerships and collaborations, you can start to draft your advertisements for the event. If you put together one main design, it can be used on posters, flyers, postcards, and online banners, and really create a unified look for your day. One of the main things to think about is reaching a representation community. The point of the community scanning day is to be inclusive and to gather memories from the community itself. And so in addition to doing some of the groundwork that we mentioned through ROPA at the beginning of this webinar, this might also mean translating marketing materials into other languages or having a healthy social media presence, or maybe even drafting personal emails to your target audiences. When you're doing your outreach and you're preparing your marketing materials, this also might be a time to make some signs to use for wayfinding during the event and to help people through the order of operations that you've determined. If you did design a logo or a look for the event, whether that's formal or not, it's nice to include that on all your communications and signage, again, to have that unified look for the day. And again, think about setting item and material limits during our outreach and through your advertising. Otherwise, you might end up with a dozen people who have jam-packed scrapbooks or fragile heirlooms or less common formats that you're not prepared to digitize during your event. Okay, so now that we know the plan for the day and our general order of operations, but what about your actual digitizing setup? So you might have decided already what you'd like to do, and you might already have some equipment at your organization that you're thinking about using. But I'm going to run through some considerations for selecting equipment and then talk about 3 general setups that you can have on the day of your community scanning day. Each one, or maybe a combination of them, might be best for your situation, based again on the format of the material that you expect to digitize, the scope of your event, and of course, on your budget. And so to pick the right tools for your scanning day, you'll have to go back and then think about the goals that we examined earlier. And so think again about your goals as hosts and then as your participants' goals as your contributors. You want to have an idea of the types of materials that you're going to be digitizing and to think about what your community is likely to bring. Another thing you also need to think about is that you need to consider the expertise of your staff and your volunteers. So do you have enough people who are comfortable with cameras to staff an entire day of digitizing at a camera stand? So remember that it's an event and people might not move through your space in an orderly fashion as you're hoping, and things might get a little hectic, depending, having those great wayfinding signs or not. And so if you only have one photographer, your photographer is going to need some breaks and you'll probably need a backup or 2. On the other hand, what should you do if someone brings an item that's out of scope for your equipment? And so again, like the man with the fire truck that I mentioned earlier, there might be other options for doing the digitization. So for instance, if someone brings a book and you only have a scanner that you're using that day, perhaps you can have someone who's taking snapshots of the event. You can simply take a picture of the person and their book and document it that way. So for your event, maybe it's going to be more logical and efficient to only have scanners, or perhaps if you have the resources, both a scanner and a digital camera. And so things might start to feel like they're getting a little elaborate, or maybe they're beyond your budget. But the good news is that there's also inexpensive ways to use tablets and smartphones for a scanning day. We know there's nothing wrong with being resourceful and using what you have on hand, and especially what you already know how to use. We know this can certainly be the most affordable and efficient way to do it. I do want to mention a quick thing about budgeting, though, because we know that this will take some monetary funds to be able to put together. And so there's a grant that's offered by the NHPRC, or the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. Again, that's NHPRC. The grant is called Public Engagement with Historical Records. And there is a link to this grant. We're going to provide that in the handout packet that's going to be sent to you after this webinar today. If you're interested in learning more, again, that'll be in our resource handout. So I've mentioned that we have 3 general ways to digitize the materials that people are bringing. The ways to digitize can be actual scanning on a flatbed scanner, photographing items with a DSLR camera and a camera stand, or maybe a more DIY approach using a tablet and a stand. And so over the next few slides, we're going to take a brief look at each type and weigh the pros and cons. So if you're focusing on photographic prints and documents for your scanning day, a scanner can be a really great option for you. We know that certain scanners are fairly affordable and they can do a great job on stable flat media. They're good for slide scanning as well, with the addition of any accessories that you might have to get, like slide holders. We're going to take a look at slide holders in the next slide. In general, you can get a good quality flatbed scanner for several $100s. When considering scanners, you want to think about the maximum DPI that they can achieve and the total size of the scanning surface. And so I think 300 DPI or PPI would do well for a scanning day. But if you want to go with a higher resolution, you have to keep in mind the intended end product, like the file size that you're creating with your scans, and the fact that the higher the DPI, the longer the scan process will take, and the more digital storage that you'll need to save these materials. If you are going for 300 DPI, scanners are going to do a great job for you, and they'll do it at a decent speed. Also remember, if you're using a scanner, you want to avoid crushing book spines or any three-dimensional aspect of an object that you're scanning. And you must know that the item that you're scanning, it must come in contact with the glass scanning surface. And so scanners, they're really specialty tools that are best reserved for certain types of flat and stable media. As I mentioned earlier, one major pro for scanners is their ability to scan slides. And so slides are a really common thing that people want to scan, and there's a few ways that you can go about it. And so first, you can purchase a slide holder and use this to securely handle your slides and scan several slides at once. These are affordable and they can be purchased on Amazon for around $20. You can see an image of a slide holder on the left here. As a pro tip, you can purchase 2 of them, and so then you can scan one slide holder while you're loading the other one. In the second image that we see here on the slide on the right, you'll see a desktop slide scanner. And so here you insert slides one by one, where they're scanned and then reformatted into a digital file. And so the one we see here on the screen is a bit of an older version. But the scanners that you can purchase today provide a high bit depth, and so that results in a faithful color quality and also allows scanning at a high DPI, which provides excellent image resolution. If you use this method, then scans can be stored in an SD card or an external drive that can then be uploaded to more permanent and preservation-friendly digital storage. Um, Slide scanners such as these, they usually cost around $200, and they can be a good investment if you have a large number of slides to scan. So for our second option that we are discussing today, another option for your scanning setup is to use a digital camera that can capture high quality images. So this is the way our own imaging services department here at NEDCC digitizes items, albeit with a variety of very technical cameras, setups, and software. So as you might expect, there's a big range of prices and specifications that happen with a digital camera as opposed to scanners. And honestly, unfortunately, getting into the technical specifications of a DSLR camera is beyond the scope of preparing for a community scanning day in our webinar today. We know a decent camera can cost several $100s, and this might also be a good option if you'd like to make a more permanent investment in some of your digitization materials that you have at your institution. And so remember that these cameras, they need to be steadied when you're photographing things for digitization. So you have the additional expense of a camera stand or a tripod, and you'll also need a consistent light source. Once you do have everything set up though, image capture can be done fairly rapidly by tethering the camera to a computer. And so when you do this, you can see a live feed of the shoot on your computer, as well as snap pictures from your desktop. This could be maybe more that you need for a community event where you're capturing images at 300 DPI. But again, a camera setup does offer the flexibility to capture different types of media and a lot of convenience. And it looks like Beth made this point in the chat box too. The biggest advantage of a camera over a scanner is that the item's surface isn't pressed against the glass, which can matter a lot for fragile items. And that is absolutely true. If you do have someone who has maybe something that's like a page from a scrapbook and they have, a birth announcement that has some ribbons on it or something like that, much safer to use a camera setup like this where you aren't crushing the materials, or if you have it's very brittle and acidic, again, a camera won't actually touch the materials and you'll have it set up above the item as we see at the image in the screen here. So it can be safer for anything that has any kind of three-dimensional quality or fragile items. And so talking about a camera, I mentioned the need for a camera stand. And so this is an additional expense. But again, if you're looking at making an investment in your digitization equipment, you could get a lot of use out of it. In this photo that we see here, we have an additional piece of equipment that's being used to read a 35mm slide. And so here you can see the camera set up. It has a stand. We have this nice light source. We have the holder for the slide. This is getting to be a very good setup that we have here, but it's also very complex and extensive. So again, think about your volunteers and your staff and who's going to be running your community scanning day. There might be a bit of a learning curve to learning how to set it all up and use it all correctly if you do want to use a setup such as this. And so again, don't forget about a light source too. And so lights can be quite low tech. So you might use clip-on lamps or maybe regular light bulbs, or you can have high-tech attachments like we see here on the right. And so the key is to try for an even light source. The key is to try for even light over the surface of the item that you're digitizing. And so this requires some expertise again, as does correcting the color. And so again, this might be too much tech again for a community scanning day. But like I've been mentioning, this could be the launch pad for further digitization projects. And it's also nice to have the option if you have the interest and the expertise. We have one person who mentioned they got a grant for a shot box here. It's a light box for capturing well-lit digital photos. It costs less than $200 and can use any type of camera. And that's great. That sounds like a really great solution for something like a community scanning day where, yeah, you can use any kind of a camera that you have with it, gives good light. If other people have recommendations for equipment that they've used at scanning days they posted it in the past, please feel free to pop those in the chat. Those can be really useful resources for other people who are watching. But, we've talked about some complex setups here and things that, do cost money. So you always can also simply use what you have. And so I think that, seeing our DIY setup that we have here, I think we've learned a lot about this during the pandemic, especially people who are, teaching online and using primary source materials or trying to scan materials for reference. We know that phones and tablets can serve as powerful imaging tools. And so a phone and a tablet, along with an all-in-one stand, can also serve as an extremely portable scanning rig. And so if you're going out into your community for a scanning day, this could really be a great option for you. The stand that we see here on the screen, it holds a tablet steady over an item that's placed on the base. The small arm near the bottom, that's a built-in LED light source too. However, as I'm sure we all know, if you've ever taken photos with a tablet or a smartphone, they're a little awkward and they usually move a little bit when you take a photo. And so there are remote clickers that you can buy that allow you to take photos without touching the screen. And this is also a helpful tip that I never knew until actually learning about it through this webinar. The headphones that come with Apple products, they usually have the same functionality when you press the volume button on the cord. And so that can be a remote clicker that you use when taking photos with an iPhone. We know that color fidelity and image resolution, there are also going to be two other factors to consider when using these tools and capturing images. So keep that in mind if you're using a more DIY setup. One more thing to think about is getting the photos off the tablet and then into your file organization system. And so you want to make sure that you have a plan for this so that you don't lose any information or the connection to the contributor. Again, we really want to make sure that we're connecting those stories to the items that are being scanned. And so file organization and getting that intellectual control is a really important part of your scanning day. Okay, so now we have a plan for the day and we've determined our actual method for digitization. And so the next step is to decide how to manage the newly created digital content that you've made. And so to make the content readily available, discoverable, and usable, you need to give some thought to the metadata that you're going to create around these digital items. And so at your event, you have all this great information about the items that you've scanned, and that's going to be contained in the forms that we discussed earlier. You want to keep that information tied to the scans all the way through the process to make them findable and interoperable. And so the easiest way to achieve this is to use the same standards that you use for the rest of your collections, or to establish some for this project that you can use in the future. So file naming and organization has a lot to do with this process too. And so you'll want to make sure that anyone who is organizing the scan files is on the same page. You know what kind of information to gather, but what information do you want to make available specifically to your user who's going to be viewing these items once you upload them and make them available? And so, of course, they don't need to know the personal information of the person who brought the item to scan, but you might choose a few select fields that are appropriate to display for all the scanned items, like the title, date, general subject keywords, original format, and of course, a unique identifier. You really want to make sure you assign one of those to every scanned item. This is going to help you put everything together on your intended platform for viewing and access. You might even be able to structure the form in a way that allows you to easily attach the story or context right to the file. Just make sure if you do that, that you don't include anything that shouldn't be made public. We're going to touch on rights and privacy in just a moment. To do all this, use a familiar metadata schema like the Dublin Core, which you might be using already for your existing digital collections, or use some control vocabulary tagging if you're going to use a more open access or public platform like Flickr. Okay, so we've talked about organizing and describing our new digital files in a way that makes them findable and usable. We also need to think about saving and storing them and doing our part as good stewards of collections. And so here on this slide, we just have a reminder of the difference between digitization for preservation and digital preservation. And so these definitions come from Paul Conway. And if you look at Paul Conway's definitions here, you also see that they have a key element in common, and that's sustainability. And so Conway stipulates that digitization for preservation involves the creation of digital objects worthy of long-term preservation. And so the activities associated with the creation of these digital objects are also activities that are central to digital preservation. The choices we make when selecting materials for digitization, capturing them digitally, describing them with metadata, and then packaging them for delivery to users, these choices are going to determine our ability to preserve the resulting digital objects long term. And so all this, it might be a little higher level than we really expect from a community scanning day, and that's okay. But this does serve as foundation for good practice now that we've created some new digital collections and we want to be able to take care of it. And so what I'd really like to emphasize here is that the community is investing their time in getting their things digitized. And so as hosts of the scanning day, we should be responsible stewards of these collections, just as we are with other materials in our archive. For digital storage, we'll take a fairly simple approach and one that's quite effective. And it's easy to remember. Some of you might be familiar with this. And so depending on your goals for the collection, you can choose to adopt the 3-2-1 rule of storage for these digital items. And so that means that 3 copies of your files on 2 different types of storage media with 1 copy offsite. And so you might have digital preservation practices in place at your institution. And if you do, that's great. But there's some simple things that can be done before if you don't have any digital preservation practices set up. One thing we recently did a workshop in Vermont, and a participant who was there, they mentioned that she backs up the digital collections at her organization, which I believe was a historical society. She backs them up on a hard drive and then takes that hard drive home with her. And so this can be one possible solution. Here in this instance, there's multiple copies of the files are on a local server and some are on the hard disk. And then she takes that offsite to her home. And so this can be a really great place to start for a small organization. Storage on the cloud can also count as storage as separate geographic location. And so we know that even though we're saying the cloud is truly a mass of servers that's located in a single site. And it's very likely that that location is not close by to where you are. And so our goal here is to have a backup at a separate location. So if your building or if your regional area is affected by a disaster, your materials are going to exist somewhere else that's not affected. Moving on to think about discovery tools, there's a variety of options to make your content accessible. And so I suggest using any sort of digital content management system that you might already have in place at your institution. However, for this slide here, the image that we see, I chose Boston Public Library's Flickr account because it's a great example of using a freely available and user-friendly platform to make digital content available to users. We know that Flickr also has an easy-to-use rights management tools, and you can pretty much select the level of permissions that you want of how much information or what you exactly will make available for access. So overall, Flickr, it's a really nice option to maintain intellectual control over your new digital content if you don't already have a new digital content management system in place. And then you want to make sure that your users know about your digital collections. So you want to promote your collections through social media. And that whole process will be more efficient if the discovery tool that you're using plays nicely with social media platforms. And so by that, I mean that you can link or repost items fairly easily while also maintaining any sort of use restrictions that you have in place for your digital content. You can also target promotion to users you think would like to use it. And so again, think about those connections that you made with your community groups and send them a link to your digital platform, or maybe let local educators know about the collections and maybe even have like a learning guide that goes along with them. So we're getting toward the end of our hour today. So we're going to wrap up today with an overview of rights. So when hosting a community scanning day, it's important to decide ahead of time what types of materials you're allowing and to make the perimeters clear to your participants. One more aspect to make participants aware of is rights and restrictions. So one major restriction is commercially produced material or any works that are subject to copyright. You get into tricky territory if somebody brought a piece of sheet music or a poem written by somebody else. So it's really best to limit digitization to original items. Additionally, commercial works are often readily available somewhere else. So you want to encourage your participants to bring in personal items and spend the time they have for digitizing their special and unique to them. There are still concerns about rights, however, on the part of your institution. So if you accept donated materials for archives and manuscripts and the like, you probably already have a standardized policy and pre-written statements about rights and use. And so you can use these for your scanning day and be prepared to explain them and to have those notices available for participants. This is where it's really best to avoid default statements like all rights reserved. It's helpful for both your institution and your users to have clear statements of responsibility. As far as making the new digital content available and accessible, OCLC research staff, with input from speakers and advisors, they've drafted a reasonable approach to balancing risk and access when making collections of unpublished materials accessible online. We have a link to that here on the screen, and that's also included in your resource handout. And so again, select your collections wisely. This is circling back around to setting clear guidelines for what can and cannot be digitized at your event. But we know that rights are confusing and your community might not quite understand what types of things are good candidates for digitization. And so it helps to give them examples like the ones that we discussed at the beginning, but keep an eye on the actual content that's coming through during the day. Once the collections are available online, provide a takedown policy statement and disclaimers to users. And so in other ways, make compliance easy if a user raises an objection to something that you posted. One thing to remember is that digital dissemination is wide and far-reaching. And so information that's exposed to a single viewer in a gallery is not the same as information exposed on a public website. If you see any of the above categories that we see here on the slide, in the items that you've scanned, you really have to keep that information private. I just add to any financial information to this list too, just to be safe. You're probably not likely to come across a modern checking account number, but just in case you do, you want to make sure that those things do not get posted to a public website along with medical information or any personal identifying information. Having said that, if the woman who we see here in this photo, which is a great photo, really no reason to be embarrassed about that, but if, for instance, someone was, if they happen to contact the NIU Regional History Center because she wanted them to remove it from their digital collections, we would hope that their takedown policy is flexible like the one that we discussed. So again, it's good to cover all your bases and have a release form alongside your scanning form. And so this is a great thing to have at the registration and welcome station and could be available to all participants, not just those who are contributing content. If you choose to document the event itself by taking photos, it's good to have permission from the people who are in those photos, especially if there are children present. And so if the form that we see here again is from the Mass Memories Roadshow, and it combines all those registration pieces into one. And so the top part is registration for the event, and the box part has both an event photo release and a rights statement for anything that they brought for digitization. So now we have two forms that we're speaking of, and it might seem like this is all going to take a lot of time here. But I think that this is overall a good thing. It gives you the opportunity to interact with your community and welcome them into the space. It also allows you to set your pace for the day. And so we know that digitization is not all that fast, and there's a few processes to keep track of throughout. So again, that file naming and the organization that needs to be done after scanning. And so you want your staff and your volunteers to be able to devote the time they need to talk with their contributors and scan their items. One thing to note about this form in particular that the Mass Memories Roadshow puts together is that they're writing it in plain language. And so again, there's no need for legalese or complex terms on these forms. So we do have just a couple minutes left today, and I'm happy to stay a little bit longer if anyone has any questions. But that's all that we have for our webinar today. So after going through all these processes, you might be thinking that perhaps you might need a larger budget for your scanning day, or maybe even a budget to work with it all. And so again, I mentioned this briefly before, but the NHPRC, or the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, they offer a grant that can be used to collect primary source material from people through public gatherings and sponsored discussions or websites about the results. And so here you can see a link to that on the screen. I also have links here to the two guidebooks that can be followed for creating your community scanning day. That's the Mass Memories Roadshow Handbook that we see here on the upper left, or I'm sorry, on the upper right. And then the link to the ROPA's roadmap for participatory archiving is on the left here. Both of these, again, are created by UMass Boston, and they're excellent sources for creating your community scanning day. We know that the Mass Memories Roadshow Handbook is freely available, and it has templates for the release form and the descriptive form that we mentioned here in this session. And so a link to it, along with all these resources, is going to be sent to you following the webinar. And so that's all we have. And so I know that was kind of a crash course and a lot of information all at once. But again, you'll be able to access these resources, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone might have in our chat box. Thanks so much. Good question. Charlotte asks, can you say a bit more about the pace of the event that you're just speaking about? Yes, so you can think about as you have, your community is showing up, everyone's lining up, they're holding their photographs, they're holding their maybe letters that they're bringing from their own, family letters and things like that. You want to make sure that you're able to kind of successfully get that information, the information you need for intellectual control, and then have that rights information filled out as well, rights for photographs, rights for digitization. You want to make sure that you're able to get that information, that people who are participating clearly understand what's going to be happening with their materials, and then they're able to move to the next station, which would be their scanning station. And so you can think about the pace that needs to happen as your participants are coming and they're entering for the day, they're filling out their forms, they're moving to the next station to get their material scanned, and then maybe they're moving to a third station after that, where they're learning information about how to care for their collections at home, or they're speaking with a local community organization. And so again, you really want to think about how will you pace these stations, how you make sure that you're getting the information you need, that the material is getting scanned and documented effectively, and that the community is also getting information out of the event. And so that's the pacing that we're talking about. Because there might be some lag time between when someone fills out their form and actually gets their material scanned. Maybe you have some chairs available. Maybe there's, a food truck outside or something. You can make something that's really festive. Maybe there's other community members there. They have stations where, like we mentioned, the photo booth, someone can get their photo taken with their item. So again, just thinking about that pacing that you need to have established. Appointments might be something, but again, this is something where people may be lining up and coming in the time that they have. And so that might be something that can cause more frustration than it's worth. Again, there's more information on those websites as well, the ROPA website and the Mass Memories Roadshow, and they'll have some great information as well for you for thinking about pacing and things like that. Thank you. Heather mentions that the Mass Memories Roadshow website has detailed descriptions of what happens at each station at their events and helps people move through the event. Quickly going through the questions here, making sure I'm not missing anyone. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciated having you here. File naming systems. So Catherine has a question. Could you speak more about file naming systems? I'm currently trying to create a naming system for the digital objects where I work. So I'd be interested in any suggested naming patterns. I am going to refer you to the Sustainable Heritage Network. They have some really great information just for file naming for digital preservation in general. Again, we want to make sure that when we're creating files, we want to name them in a way that gives them context, so we know we're not going to name something like, JPEG image 1234, and then have 12345 next or something like that. We want to do a file naming convention. So for instance, it can be something like the date of your event. So it could be something like 4/11/2023 underscore community ComScan day underscore photo or something like that. We want to be able to give, contextual information to the files that we're creating. So that way, in case they do get dissociated from any of the, other digital files that you have, you don't have just a weird hard drive that's full of randomly named materials. So I can try to find maybe something that's specific for a community scanning day. Again, this might be something that you can find in the Mass Memories Roadshow handbook, but I'm going to refer you to the Sustainable Heritage Network. And let me see if I can find a quick link to them on the web. They are an excellent organization when it comes to learning about digital preservation. And they provide such great resources, webinars, file naming techniques, all of that kind of information. They'd be a great website to check out. But again, I'm going to look a little bit more into that and see if there's something I can include on your handout for following the webinar. Yeah, Matthew's provided, there you go. Matthew's provided some great information there, a numbered abbreviation, using the date, location, the unique identifier, based on the forms, excellent. And public members providing the items, and then a continuous number. That is an excellent file naming convention to follow. Thank you, Matthew, for contributing that. And we are just a little over time. If there's any other questions that you have, please let me know. I'll stay here for just a couple more minutes and then we'll sign out for the day. I apologize, my internet is running slowly. It's Sustainable Heritage Network is the website. Yes. Sorry about that, Sonia. It's the Sustainable Heritage Network. And I'm so sorry. My internet is just being very slow. So I'm going to get a link here. Sorry about that. This is a link to the information they have on photographs and images. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for your question. Okay. If there's no more questions for the day, I'm going to go ahead and sign us out. I'm going to stop our recording.